Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Chris Lowney. I will tell you all about Chris in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's so often called the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, the compassion we exert toward others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will very much discover that Chris is, you do it with a purpose of bringing people together for common cause. Chris Lowney, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thanks, John. It's my pleasure.
Great. Chris is the vice chair of the board of CommonSpirit Health, the nation's largest nonprofit health system. And he is a one-time Jesuit seminarian, which we will explore. And then he went to J.P. Morgan. I love this story. And he's worked around the world in more than 2 dozen countries. He's the author of 6 books and co-authored 2 more. His best-selling Heroic Leadership about Jesuit leadership was a seminal influence on me, then translated into 11 languages, and it's on the recommended list of the Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Chris is very much an ecumenicalist, and his stories about Christians, Muslims, and Jews in medieval Spain has relevance to today. He wrote a book on Pope Francis called Pope Francis, Why He Leads the Way He Leads, and other books. So Chris also contributes to Forbes and many other places. Chris, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, John. And you should give yourself some props because you introduced me to Forbes.
Well, I will. I'll take all credit for that. Anyway, folks, if you have to know this. Chris has been a seminal influence on me, and the show regular viewers know that I was Jesuit educated, and so after I had written a couple of books, and I think I had started coaching, I came across this wonderful book called Heroic Leadership. And it's a story of best practices from a 450-year-old company that changed the world. That company, quote, happens to be the Jesuits. So when I read this book, I said, whoa, this is where all my ideas come from. I felt like I was in North Korea. I had been so indoctrinated into what leadership really is that by quantifying it, as Chris did lovingly in Heroic Leadership, it crystallized my thinking. So welcome, my friend, and thank you.
Thank you, John.
Great. So what led you to write Heroic Leadership? What prompted you to do it?
So as you introduced me, so I was a Jesuit for a few years, worked at J.P. Morgan for about 2 decades, and like a lot of the folks who are watching us and who work with you, you work in a big company. Every month somebody gives you some book about leadership, and some of them are wonderful, with far better ideas than I've ever come up with and ever will come up with. But frankly, a lot of them are total nonsense, very superficial tricks, tactics. And, I used to think, actually, weirdly, the formation I got in a seminary was somehow more relevant than some of this nonsense I'm reading in this book or that book. And so when my time came to leave Morgan, I just thought it might be fun to think about the Jesuits not in like a spiritual, religious way, the way most people would when they interact with that organization, but rather to think about especially their early history and their traditions and say, could I somehow frame in ideas and language that would be accessible to folks of any or no spiritual tradition, could I somehow frame what I understood from my own past to be some of the principles that help them to lead well and be successful. So that was the origin of the book.
Well, and you did a beautiful job in it because this book is very secular, if one can say that, and non-sectarian. And so it resonates to people of faith or people of no faith. And you quantify it into 4 attributes, which will take them one at a time: self-awareness, ingenuity, love, and heroism. Now, my colleague, Tasha Urich, wrote a wonderful book called Insight, and she talks about self-awareness being very, very difficult to attain. What's your perspective on that, Chris?
Yeah. So I'll just briefly define the idea, and then I'll address exactly the comment you make, John. So when I talk about self-awareness in the book, what I'm talking about is the idea that one makes a foundational investment first in appreciating one's own strengths, weaknesses, values. What do you stand for? How should we treat other human beings? Why we're here on Earth? These deep things. And then it has some kind of a daily tool or mechanism for keeping oneself updated on how it's going, and is one kind of on track, wandering off track. And those who are groupies of the Jesuits would know that they kind of pioneered a little technique for daily updating, just taking a few minutes to first get out of the flux of daily life, no social media, no television, and instead just say, well, what's going on inside me? How were the last few hours? Is there any lesson I can learn about myself? And, I think that, John, goes to the comment that you just shared, about hard to come by self-awareness, because I think the very modern contemporary phenomenon for a lot of us, certainly for me, is that we're kind of floating on this river, email, meeting, phone call, text, distraction, and we kind of are like Formula One drivers who imagine we're going to go on this 500-mile race without ever taking a pit stop to assess, do I need how things are going, and so on. So I think that if people aren't self-aware, it's just because the pace of life takes us so much into the flow that we don't have this habit of stepping back.
Well, you're right. And I think the thing about the self-awareness is so many leaders, it takes work. And I think so many leaders push it to the side because they think they have other things to do. And so, I always try to coach people to have reflections. And you mentioned the Jesuits. What is the daily practice? Is it reading the breviary, or is it something else?
Yeah, I mean, they would have daily practices that all priests would have to do. But what I was specifically referring to is an idea that the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola, sort of formulated himself. And he, if I could encapsulate it in terms that all of us could appreciate, he would say, okay, look, why don't you try to identify a couple of times during the day when you could regularly take 5 or 10 minutes apart. Could be right after lunch, could be the way home from work, could be before I go to bed. Just pick out a couple of times that I could stick to. And then during those few minutes, maybe first start off by being grateful. What do I have to be grateful for? Daily life is all about problems and to-do lists. Just for a moment, it's okay to say, look, I'm happy that I'm alive, or whatever it might be. And then second, in one way or another, raise your perspective a little bit. Like instead of living with this incredibly near-term focus of this is the next text, this is the next thing, maybe raise a perspective to, gee, why did I take this job anyway? Or what's the most important thing I have to do for the year? And then a third step, again, in these couple of minutes, just mentally replay the last few hours, meetings I was in, people I encountered, problems I dealt with. Was I my best self? Did I fall short? What could I learn? Do I have any amends that I want to go and make because I was such an ass in that meeting? Something like that.
Yeah, that's great. I honestly have not heard of it doing such reflections or exercises more than once a day. So that's a wonderful practice, and it's kind of current and working into it. Now, the next one is, to me, the one that knocked my socks off, because I wouldn't have expected it, but knowing Jesuit history, it makes common sense, and that's ingenuity. And there's a story that you tell of the first Jesuit missionary to China who, typical Jesuit tradition, goes straight to the top. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, the idea of ingenuity, which folks could guess, is, the world is going to keep changing, and only folks who have some ability to adapt are going to manage to lead their lives well or lead organizations well. And this is just getting, I think, more and more imperative as the pace and volatility of change around us continues, And I think the last people you would think of as role models for adaptability are like 16th century priests, you know?
No, it would not be
And
top of mind for me, and that's why it
no,
was so charming to read.
and that's why this story so struck and charmed me, you know? And, you know, Jesuits and priests had kind of, it had always been the great dream to go to China and to interact with that very learned society. And, you know, 16th century being what it was, part of their vision was conversion. Now we have a more enlightened view of interacting with those of other cultures. But anyway, folks had gone and, of course, gotten absolutely nowhere. You know, like
Yeah.
these folks would show up with these black outfits, and the Chinese are thinking, you know, who are these guys, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this one guy, Matteo Ricci, goes and says, you know, I'm going to have to somehow not reinvent my bedrock beliefs. And that's important for all of us. You know, whatever is our business, there are things we have to stand for that really aren't negotiable. But in terms of how we interact with folks, how we express those beliefs, how we talk, the things we present, you know, all of those maybe can be on the table at one moment or another. And so to make a medium story short, he kind of appreciates that, well, first of all, he's going to have to learn the language and culture. Second, he's not going to present himself in a way that Romans or Italians would recognize as a holy person, but rather let me dress myself in a way that Chinese intelligentsia would say, oh, this must be a learned holy person who has something to offer. And, you know, he tries to understand what of his culture, like geometry, like map making, does he have to share that would be of value to those he's visiting. So to me, it's kind of a wonderful human story of adaptability, but also a kind of a lesson to the rest of us that I think sometimes we, you know, human beings can err either way. For some of us, nothing can change. We're just locked into this rigid way of approaching life and approaching other people, and that is not going to work in the long run. On the other hand, for some people, nothing is core. Everything's up for grabs. Everything is negotiable. Everything can be compromised away, and that doesn't work either. So finding that balance, I think, is a great mark of folks who succeed in life and as leaders.
It's a great story of how to connect and persuade with others. Now, the next step that you have is would not be unexpected, and that's love. And my favorite story about love is another Jesuit product, is Vince Lombardi. He used to talk about the love that he had for his players and players for one another. Not common at his time in the National Football League, but a Jesuit expression of love is service. Am I correct in this? So
yeah. You know, and love. I mean, John, you work in and with a lot of folks in big corporations. I was a J.P. Morgan guy, so you can imagine, like, when I was thinking about what to call this value in an organizational setting, I would like picture these guys on trading floors at J.P. Morgan and say, "Oh man, like, what are they going to make of this?" You know?
yeah.
And I toyed with different words. Respect, deep respect, but unfortunately, you know, respect, which is a value we should deeply champion, often has such a jaded, it elicits such a jaded reaction because a lot of us don't get the respect we feel is proper, you know?
Right.
So in the end, I said, okay, I've got to use this word. And what I was getting at was a way of looking at other people, whether they're my colleagues, those who work for me, even those I might serve as customers or clients, in a way that starts from the idea that each person has a lot of potential, and part of my human purpose is to unlock their potential and help them develop to the best of their abilities to flourish in a word.
Right.
And you know, you mentioned Vince Lombardi, which is interesting and curious to me because I was kind of hesitant to use the word, but what I've found since is that the tougher the environment folks seem to work in, the more they get that. You know, like I can't tell you how many times I've had military guys, especially Marines, come up to me, or ex-Marines, come up to me after talks and say, oh, you know, like we're all about that. I mean, we understand that, like and the more I thought about it, the more it actually made sense to me. The more you appreciate how deeply humans sometimes have to depend on each other, the more you realize, yes, this is an appropriate way of talking about the relationships that need to bind us.
Without question. I had guests on this show who've expressed the very same thing with military backgrounds. I know what you mean. And it's the cohesion. It's really fundamental to any unit cohesion, but especially when one is in a challenging situation such as combat or high stress, whatever, you definitely build that. Now, the final thing, and it's heroic leadership, but you cast a little bit of a different lens on it. And it's kind of everyday heroism, is it not? So tell me about heroic leadership in that context, Chris.
Yeah. So thank you for broaching that and already beginning to clarify, because stereotypically when we hear a word like heroic, what we're thinking is saving someone in a burning building, these kinds of things. And, instead, the essence of what I'm talking about first is that we would somehow be the kind of people who, importantly, are willing to work for purposes greater than ourselves. And at the end of the day, that's what heroism is. Folks who sometimes in a very dramatic scale, but also a lot of times in a very prosaic scale, are just willing to say, something, yeah, of course I want to get ahead. I have my own agenda, my own wishes, my own ego, status, money. But at the end of the day, I'm here for something bigger than all that. And I'm willing to enlist some of my energy and talent and time in a purpose that's bigger than me. So that's the kind of essence of heroism that I'm getting
at. And that's great, because you have we call it heroic living, which is essentially living with purpose and making that resonate. Am I correct in that, Chris?
Yeah, you're totally right. You're totally right.
Yeah.
In a way, heroic leadership was is the publisher's words and idea, not mine, because they were the ones who asked me to write the second book. Their idea was, well, heroic leadership this is what it looks like. Heroic living is more like, now how do I do it? Like what kind of practices, what kind of things do I have to do to bring out these virtues and values in myself? So that was the purpose of that.
Now, you have another book which was also influential to me, and it is called Make Today Matter, 10 Habits for a Better Life. And in there's a line that I stole from my book, Grace. And that is that gratitude is like cholera. It's contagious. So that is a great line. So anyway, so what led you to write this Daily Habits book and give us some context for it? So.
Yeah. John, I think honesty and transparency really have their place in the world. And that was another idea that, I suppose what I should do is make up some kind of story about how I've always deeply dreamed of writing this book, and these ideas were animating me for decades. But, the honest story was that you'll remember this wonderful commencement address that then became a great little book, First Make Your Bed.
Yeah.
And when Admiral McRaven shared some of his his lessons learned from his career. And so afterward, after that book came out, my contact at the publisher that had done these previous books called me and said, oh, something, given the way the world we're living in now, folks really want to digest things in more bite-sized chunks. That look at First Make Your Bed and how well that did, and could you maybe reformulate some of the themes that have floated along in some of these other books into more bite-sized pieces, if I'm not embarrassed to put it that way. So really that's what the book was, to kind of reduce to habit. I hope the habits themselves are somewhat profound, but the description of them in the book are quite easy and quick and bite-sized.
Right. Well, you have a thought in the book, and I'd like to delve into that. And you talk about that it often takes a crisis to make us better. Is that because we're basically content and beings of inertia, or what? So,
I wish I knew, and
you wrote the book. Come on.
yeah, I mean, the particular crisis that I think I cited in the book was, remember those terrible floods in Houston some years ago, and of course nowadays there are terrible climactic disasters in all kinds of places. And the thing that was, other than the sheer magnitude of the disaster, one of the things that was so powerful to many of us was just to see these everyday Houstonians really rising to the occasion and looking out for their neighbors and so on. And how many times, I bet everybody who's watching us could tell a story of, I don't know what, somebody fell and was injured in some freak accident, and how bystanders came and helped them. I came across somebody in serious need and I stepped up and helped. I mean, we all know these kind of stories. And so
we call that, Chris, to us professionals, we call that grace. Very definitely. No, you're so true. And so you have something, I like this, like, don't win the race, contribute to the race. So are you talking about everybody gets a participant trophy, or what are you talking about?
I guess what I'm getting to is, to put it in other words, two fundamental ways of looking at how we participate in the world as human beings.
Right.
One is competitive. I'm here to win the race. And I mean, look, J.P. Morgan Life was all about who makes it to VP first, or, the end of the year, you get your bonus for 5 minutes, you're delighted. Then you start to think, oh, gee, who might have gotten a bigger bonus? And you find a way to become unhappy about this.
Right.
So that's one way. Or, I need the bigger house, the newer car, whatever the heck it might be. Right. So that's one way of conceptualizing our being here on Earth. But a very different way of conceptualizing it is, no, I'm not here to outdo people. I'm here somehow to contribute to the human race, and however we frame that in our own minds, to leave the world better than I found it, to be somebody who gives more love than I receive, whatever frame animates us. And I guess that chapter kind of puts on the table one way of thinking about life, I think, opens the possibility of happiness if we're there to contribute. The other way, we're there to compete, I think ultimately can never be satisfying, because if you're a competitive person, there's always somebody who has more, has accomplished more, who has the prize that you don't have. So that chapter kind of invites folks to think about how you conceive the very essence of your humanity here.
Okay. You have some, I like this. Another good phrase is keep walking uphill, which I have to do now because I've got busted knees. And so it's less pressure if I walk uphill, but it's harder. So what do you mean from it in a lifetime, or I'm sorry, a lifestyle context? What does it mean?
Yeah. So the chapter title takes itself from a story. I once was in Caracas giving a couple of talks, and had the privilege of visiting one of the slums on the hills outside of Caracas. And it's a pretty tough, difficult environment. And there was a sister, a nun, who's been working there in a school for impoverished kids for 50 years. And when she first came, she literally used to have to walk up the hill. I mean, there was no transport whatsoever. Right. So used to, every day, up the hill, down the hill. And, we have this fairy tale vision of how we interact with the world, that that things are getting better as a result of our efforts. And often that is the case. In this particular case, it struck me that, that place has been sliding downhill for 5 decades, that she's been going up and down. And she was in no way a bitter, jaded person, and it really struck me as a wonderful life attitude and skill. In other words, to say, look, what I'm doing is important, and I'm going to keep walking up the hill every day. And sometimes the results will be obvious and will come. Sometimes they won't. But I'm going to believe that what I'm doing is important enough that even if I can't see the results, it's still worth doing the way I think it ought to be done. So walk up the hill every day.
Yeah, and that's and you raised something that's interesting. That's I think that we don't consider enough. And your story reminded me, of course, of Mother Teresa, and we regard her quote as a saint, which means she's a holy person. But the thing about Mother Teresa that always intrigued me was her sense of self-doubt and doubt about an eternal life or whatever. So, but that didn't cripple her. So, what's your perspective on doubt as it comes to our purpose? Have you had a reflection on that? So, Chris.
Now you're really taking me into very profound.
Hey, it's that Jesuit background, I'm telling you.
So, I mean, I'll share one or two thoughts off the top of my head. I haven't thought about it in any deep way, but
Yeah.
I guess I would say this. I mean, it feels to me sometimes doubt is nothing more than temptation that needs to be pushed away. I'm doing the right thing, and doubt is a temptation to despair that I can't give into. I just have to push away. Every once in a while, doubt is really important. Doubt is the conscience or the intellect or some way of saying, hey, Chris, you need to rethink something here, And to me, maybe to circle all the way back to our opening discussion about self-awareness, human wisdom, human judgment is to be willing to step back and reflect on what's going on here in this doubt, and the wisdom to say, oh, something, I'm just being tempted in this case. I just have to push that doubt away and forget.
No,
or this is a helpful prompt for me to think more deeply.
Great.
And which is which?
Yeah,
Good judgment is what helps.
I'm a big believer in self-doubt. And just what you said, because I think it leads to our self-awareness. It leads to, if we address it, as you said, it challenges us to think more deeply. Is this the right thing for me, or is it a distraction? Should I stop, not do it later, whatever? And so, but it's when we let it cripple us, we're paralytic, then we need, to talk to somebody about it. But I think it's part of human nature, really, and it's part of our self-awareness. So, in my opinion. Now, unfortunately, Chris, we could keep on going, but we're coming close to our end. And then, as you know, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one that you'd like to share with us? So.
I might share a somewhat recent story. I mean, I suspect just about no one would know the history of CommonSpirit healthcare system very well, but it's the product of a merger about 3 years ago from two very large health systems that came together, and we've renamed ourselves CommonSpirit. And so I was on the board and helped negotiate the merger. And it's a wonderful and not always flattering human experience to go through a negotiation and then a merger,
No, it's tough, hard work.
You're sort of confronted with sometimes, some of your characteristic weaknesses and so on. And one of them is, for example, this temptation to feel like, oh, I know what's right. Especially in a merger when it's like, who's winning? Those people think differently. They have a way of doing it. No, we do it this way. We have the right way of doing it. And so you struggle with those things. And over the course of these early years of forming our new self as a board and as a system, and especially as we went through COVID, it's been a deeply graced experience to me to appreciate the gifts and talents of everyone else in a group. In other words, to get beyond this thing of, oh, the way we did it, or my idea, I need to defend my idea, fight for my idea, and instead to be open to the many gifts that others bring to the table,
That's a great thing. And, again, it goes back to that self-awareness, the ability and the courage to say, hey, I don't have all the answers, and our system doesn't. And fortunately, it sounds like you're in a positive environment where I'm sure it wasn't hunky-dory all the time, but at least there was a creation of a spirit where people could learn from one another and adapt that way, because that doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah,
as you know.
Beautifully so.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, it's been wonderful talking to you. How can people find you?
There's a website, chrislowney.com. I'm easily findable on LinkedIn. Very happy to connect with folks. And I know you're not supposed to say this, but I mean, if people want to send me an email, Chris Lowney, one word, at Gmail. I'm always happy to interact with folks. And I just hope, John, that you don't have a million bots that tune into your broadcast here, flood me with spam.
No, that's great. Anyway, Chris, you are a terrific guest. And again, your writing has shaped my thinking, and I'm grateful to that. So thank you. And with that,
It was my great pleasure.
Close out. So.